The One That Got Away. He was 14, and his name was Arthur Thaw. I'll never forget him. He lived in a cardboard box campsite under the Burnside Bridge in Portland, Oregon. I first read about him in 1980 in a newspaper article that called him the littlest hobo. I was intrigued, and eventually I reached a young volunteer at the Salvation Army storefront, which was one of Arthur's hangouts. We made arrangements to meet, and I flew to Portland. I knew from the articles, there turned out to be many of them, that Arthur was an incorrigible runaway whose parents were ill-equipped to know how to handle him. Since early childhood, he'd been accustomed to hopping freight trains and riding the rails until he was picked up. When I met the young man who'd befriended Arthur and initially spoke for him at the storefront, I began to learn the astonishing details. The courts had no guidelines for dealing with him. He was not a criminal. They'd never encountered a case like his. And because his parents weren't able to cope with him, and there was no legal precedent for jailing him at that age, a judge had erroneously committed him to an insane asylum. On several occasions, and with good cause, Arthur escaped and hit the rails again. Now he was virtually an emancipated minor, and lived primarily on his own, thumbing his nose at authority. Even with all I'd come to know about him, when Arthur heard I was no threat and agreed to meet with me on the safe, neutral ground of the storefront, I was still unprepared. He was small and thin, almost wizened, with a tangled nest of brown hair. His face and hands and clothes, everything was filthy. There was an air of furtiveness about him, but also a certain self-confidence and poise. He was not talkative, but he was cocky. I soon learned that was his demeanor outside of the street. Inside, anywhere, he was like a caged bird. Either way, you could not help being touched by him. A number of things happened between us in just a day or so. With his permission, I interviewed his parents in their small suburban home. I think one of the reasons they agreed to see me was that I was trying to option Arthur's story for a TV movie, for a modest sum, by Hollywood standards, but obviously a considerable amount by theirs. Arthur's father was a jailhouse cook, his mother an Avon lady. They were confused about Arthur, but resigned. Once in a while, they said, he'd sneak into the house to sleep and wash his clothes. And then he was gone again. He'd always been a problem child. School was out of the question. They agreed to my meeting with Arthur's social workers, who gave me unprecedented access to his files. The people I talked with were sympathetic but ineffective. Everything I'd read or heard was confirmed by their casework. Arthur probably had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, among other things, but there was no way they could treat him without his cooperation, and he refused to cooperate. 20 years ago, I'm not sure ADHD was even thought of. Arthur and I talked alone in a small room at a local church, and he agreed to let me tape our conversation. It was pretty one-sided. During the hour or so we spent together inside that room, he grew increasingly restless, his eyes darting everywhere, focusing on the windows. He squirmed continuously in the splintered wooden chair, his grimy fingers drumming on the table. Finally, I was as uncomfortable as he was, and we left to get something to eat at a hamburger joint he knew. Seated at a rickety booth inside the Greasy Spoon, I asked him if he wanted to wash his hands before we ate. He said what for, and dug into his food aggressively. He was very hungry. He must have been hungry a lot. Afterwards, we strolled for a couple of hours through the low-end territory where Arthur clearly felt at home, while he continued to chain smoke. Actually, we didn't really stroll. Arthur trotted like Dustin Hoffman in Midnight Cowboy. His gait was purposeful, deliberate, as if he always had a destination. He seemed in a way to be making some kind of rounds. Everyone on the street knew him and called his name, including the police, who called out and waved to him from passing patrol cars. He mumbled something about their keeping an eye on him. What I heard was that they were looking out for him. I thought he was beginning to trust me a little when we crossed over the freeway on a pedestrian walk, then down a brush-covered embankment, through the undergrowth, along a vague, narrow path beside the chain-link fence that separated us from the traffic, and under the railroad bridge, where we stooped low as we entered a dark, damp, cluttered area of haphazard makeshift campsites. No one was there that afternoon. The place looked abandoned, but Arthur assured me it was pretty crowded at night, sometimes dangerously so, except when the cops staged a surprise raid to temporarily clear it. They usually had plenty of time to run, Arthur said. His friends were all older, he told me, and he took me to a small, run-down apartment building. It sat alone in the city block, embraced by disreputable vacant lots, where one of them lived, in an unexpectedly clean and tidy room. Arthur introduced me rather formally, and I gathered he thought this friend, who was maybe in his late 40s but looked older and weather-beaten, probably from alcohol, had been a teacher, or even a professor, who was now down on his luck. I noticed there were quite a few books lying around, some of them open and face down. The man was polite and articulate. He said that Arthur stayed with him in the room when it got too cold or rainy under the bridges, but never for long. Sometimes they ate together or shared a beer. I had to remind myself that Arthur was just 14. I wanted to believe it was an innocent friendship. I stayed in Portland for 2 days, 3 at most, but it seemed like a miniature lifetime. In that short span, Arthur's world became more real to me than my own. Returning to my hotel at night, and finally coming back to L.A. was strangely disconcerting. I was never able to sell anyone on producing Arthur's story, or even developing it beyond a rough outline. I soon went on to other things, and it's just as well. I came to feel that showing him off in some kind of commercial film would be self-serving and invasive. But the memories and impressions have stayed with me. And they still seem as vivid as they were at first, years ago. I often think about Arthur. He's almost 40 now, if he's still alive. But I try to see him as that free and independent spirit kid, hopping trains and waving to policemen, and living warm and dry under the bridges without having to run.